Hello and welcome back to the studio. It is a very late and very stormy night here, but I am happy to talk about the new Pure Aero. As a self-proclaimed not Babolat guy, I have to say that I am very excited and I respect the changes of this racket. So let's talk about what makes this racket so different from the other generations of Pure Aeros. So we'll just get the change of cosmetics out of the way. I feel like Babolat has kind of been stuck in this pattern of a certain paint job style or design, I would say, and this one completely upsets that. They basically destroyed whatever the identity was design-wise of the Pure Aero aesthetically, and came up with this, which is kind of a loud and very modern digital camo type of design. It sort of reminds me of the type of design you might see on like a Call of Duty gun skin. I haven't played Call of Duty in a long time, but this just kind of reminds me of the type of designs that might be one of the skins on some gun that you would get at some level. You know what I mean? It's kind of loud, it's kind of modern, it's fresh, it's young. That's what I feel when I look at it. And instead of having a matte finish, it is now gloss after I don't know how long it's been matte. I feel like at least ever since 2013. Somebody want to let me know in the comments when the last time a Pure Aero or an Aero Pro Drive or whatever generation of this rackets was gloss. I don't know, but somebody out there might let us know in the comments. That'd be awesome. But I feel like this generation of Pure Aeros is so exciting because, well, first of all, the Pure Aero really represents a type of tennis. I feel like Babolat and Rafael Nadal at some point just started to change the way that tennis wanted to be played by the consumers and by the professionals coming up at the time. I feel like this racket, as well as Nadal, represent some of the most important changes to happen to tennis in the last decade, maybe two. Nadal, being who he is one of the most influential players in tennis. And that's largely due to his success as well as his game style. He has such extreme spin. He is so intense at the baseline. And this racket was designed to complement him and his play style. So there's really nothing like the Pure Aero series. And for some time, it kind of felt like a lot of other companies that were trying to compete with the sales of the Pure Aero racket were trying to be their own version of the Pure Aero in so many ways. And as someone who kind of had their pulse on the racket industry, after a certain point I kind of felt annoyed. Like a lot of companies would just come out with a racket and I felt like, all right, here's another Pure Aero knockoff, you know? Now my first serious racket about 10 years ago was actually the Aero Pro Drive, which is what they called this racket that long ago, and maybe for another generation or so after that. But I did own an Aero Pro Drive. I believe it was the 2013 model. And I got a lot better in that time span of owning that racket. I developed a technique that was very heavily based on spin. Now, when I came into tennis at the time, I wasn't really aware of Rafael Nadal. I wasn't really aware or conscious of his play style or who he was or what he represented in terms of the type of tennis, stylistically and whatever. I wasn't necessarily aware of that. There was a period of time where I was playing with this group of players. It was a lot of doubles and my tennis was getting quite a lot better, quite faster. And I had actually gotten back into tennis with almost 10 years off. And I was playing with some Dunlop racket that weighed like 9 point something ounces and was really head heavy. It had that hammer balance, if you know what I mean. I pretty quickly outgrew that in the time period where I started to play tennis again. I think it was maybe about a year before I started to look into serious rackets, if you will. And after some demoing and trying some rackets from some friends of mine, I ultimately felt like, wow, this Pure Aero feels amazing. Or I guess it was the Aero Pro Drive at the time. So that actually wasn't a racket I was demoing. I was demoing a bunch of stuff at the time. It was a friend's racket that I tried that was the Aero Pro Drive, and that one just felt so like the racket that I wanted. So I went and bought one and I played with it, and that was my racket. That felt like home for some time. And I became more and more of a spin-heavy player. However, as I grew with that Aero Pro Drive, I did feel like I wasn't able to penetrate through the ball when I wanted to. I wanted to be able to hit the way that I like to hit, but also when it's time to put that ball away, I don't always want to have to brush over the ball so much just to keep the ball in. So, you know, this was quite some time ago, so my level and the way that I thought about tennis and everything, how I set my rackets up and everything was very different. I was a different tennis player, different level, different strings, just a little bit different everything. But at the time, I do remember running into a wall where I felt like I just have to hit every shot by brushing over it. I can never really just go through the ball. The racket doesn't allow me to do that. So the timeline is that I got back into tennis and I hit with that weird Dunlop racket for like a year, and I got a lot better in that time span. And then I got a real racket after about a year, right? And then I got a real racket. It was the Aero Pro Drive, the 2013 model. And I think I played with that for about maybe a year and a half or so. And that was around the time that I felt like really sick of that kind of gimmicky play style of that racket, if you will. And I'm just saying it that way because that's how I felt at the time. I'm not saying that it was that, but that's how it felt at the time. You know how it is. Sometimes you just notice something about a racket and you can't stop feeling it. You get sick of it. You want to try something else. And so I did. I went back into the rabbit hole of demos, and that was really my first time doing that ever since getting that racket. And I messed around with some rackets here and there. I had the Techstream Pro 95. I think the Techstream Pro 95 was a Prince racket, black and green. And I liked that for some time, actually. But then after that, I went to the Pro Staff. And the Autograph Pro Staff became my racket for some time. So I got that racket partly because I wanted something that was so unlike my Babolat. I wanted something that was the opposite. Obviously, I wanted it to still offer me a lot of things that favored my playstyle, and I felt like it did do that. I had great access to spin still, but I felt so much more plow through and penetration with that racket, and I was pretty quick to just decide that's my racket. Now, I did consciously buy it because I knew that it was a little bit too heavy for me, but at the time I felt like that was a good thing, like that was going to be a good thing for my tennis. This racket's too heavy for me. I'm going to get stronger, and it's going to force me to fix certain discrepancies maybe in my take back or my follow through. That was my mindset going into it. I had a very growth oriented mindset going into a racket that was going to exploit some weaknesses or sloppiness in my technique, if you will. So that desire plus wanting to get something very different from how my Babolat felt on contact going through a ball, I ended up with the Pro Staff Autograph for almost 2 years, I think. I really loved that racket. I gave it a custom paint job and everything. Me and that Pro Staff had some times. So all in all, that story's purpose is to describe to you that I have a little bit of a story arc with this type of racket. And every now and then I would dabble in Babolat rackets, and I could kind of tell that Babolat rackets always felt a certain way, and it always reminded me of the way that the Pure Aero felt. And I'm talking like Pure Strikes, the Pure Drive, obviously that's like basically a sister or brother racket to the Pure Aero. And yeah, just any Babolat racket really felt so Babolat, if you will. And a lot of people know what I mean, but it's kind of this hollow, kind of just like slappy racket. And I just, especially on like volleys and stuff, but just also really heavy forehands where I wanted to drive through the ball, I just felt like, oh, it's such a Babolat. Like I would just know that this is a Babolat if I was doing a blind test. And I became a little bit anti-Babolat. And there were just so many things about the Pure Aero racket that I just looked at and I was just like, oh, come on, you know? And then on top of that, I'm also aware of the fact that Nadal's playing with what he's playing with, but it's not necessarily much like the consumer version of the racket at all. That being said, did I ever feel like it was a bad racket? Absolutely not. I didn't. I just felt like a lot of people just bought that racket because Nadal plays with it, and it annoyed me because I know that Nadal doesn't really play with a racket that's anything like the one that you're buying, so I was kind of like, ugh, and it feels such like a Babolat racket. Silly stuff that I'm saying, but that was my opinion, and, you know, I think there's some merit to my observations, but this is different. This racket actually feels a lot like what I wish the Pure Aero felt like at the time that I switched, and I know that it's quite some time ago, but the Pure Aero racket has always stayed really true to its identity and has always stayed very true to what it is. That being said, they do update the racket every now and then to kind of keep up with the times, keep up with the desires and demands of their consumers. I think Babolat does a really good job of doing that. I was listening to a podcast where one of the lead designers or engineers of this racket series, he broke down their process of how they collect data and how they make decisions on what they're going to do for the next generation of Pure Aeros. And that was a great podcast. It was hosted by Michelle on Tennis Warehouse's podcast. I forget. I think it's called Talk. Is it called Talk Tennis? Tennis Talk? I don't know. I feel like I'm shouting out the wrong podcast, but maybe that's the right one. But this racket is going in a really different direction while still managing to be a Pure Aero. I love to hit with topspin. As I said, it's an essential part of my game. I'm able to generate overwhelming amounts of spin for some people on a lot of shots. I'm very comfortable with super high forehands, super low forehands. I can hook them. and get some crazy short angles with a lot of pace because I'm able to rip that ball back in with spin. And I want a racket that's able to produce that kind of spin. Now, there aren't too many rackets that do a great job of that and still feel like they're able to plow through on a moment where you really want to. It just feels like it always has to be hit that way. Although right now I'm hitting with an E-Zone 98, and I guess I'd consider that kind of my main racket. And that is an extremely versatile racket for me, and it gets massive amounts of spin, or at least I'm able to generate massive amounts of spin with it for whatever reason, despite the fact that it's a 98 E-Zone, not exactly a spin-oriented racket or marketed racket, but I do get crazy spin with the E-Zone 98. And one of the things that's always made Yonex very different from a brand like Babolat is that, especially when you're comparing it to a Pure Aero and you take an E-Zone and you put it side by side with a Pure Aero, the string patterns are the same, right? They're both 16 by 19s, but the Yonex drill pattern is so much more dense than the Pure Aeros, like massively different. It's like a bigger difference than when you compare a 16 by 19 to an 1820. When you compared an E-Zone to a Pure Aero, it was just night and day. If you look at the sweet spot area and how big those squares are, for example, it's very, very obvious that the spacing between strings on the mains and the crosses are way further apart on the Pure Aeros. And it's been like that for quite some time. So I always felt like that racket is just designed to eat strings pretty much because the strings are so far spaced apart. There's really very little space, especially in the sweet spot, for the strings to distribute the load of impact. And on top of that, it's a racket that's really designed for topspin. You're hitting hard and you're hitting with spin, and there's very low density in the sweet spot. Like, it was easy for me to break strings within 3 hits or so on a racket like that. I'm breaking strings over here like every 5 to 6 hits on an E-Zone, way denser string pattern, right? So I am a string breaker, and it just annoyed me that the Pure Aero series was just so open. Anyway, I'm going to end my rant there. Matter of fact, I feel like this Pure Aero kind of ended my rant. It's like, okay, we're going to close up that string pattern, and actually, if you line this up next to an E-Zone 100, which is crazy for me to say that, but if you line this right up next to an E-Zone 100, which I have here, I can grab a picture for you, the string pattern looks almost the same. Now, we should compare that to a previous generation of Pure Aeros next to this Pure Aero, and you'll see what I mean. The crosses stay way more open as you move down and up on the racket, right? So I just lined up some crosses here around the sweet spot, right? These rackets are in the same position, and massive difference. Absolutely massive difference. Now, if you listen to that podcast that I was talking about, he will talk about how they designed this racket intentionally to have a little bit more control, a little bit more stability. And that's exactly what I feel with this racket. I actually look at this racket and I play with this racket. This is a racket I would switch to. If I really felt like it, I could switch to this. I could play the type of tennis that I've been playing with my E-Zone 98. Like, I would say that these are relatively interchangeable for me. It almost seems as though there was some time where brands like Yonex and Head and all that were taking notes from Babolat. Like, pretty much every brand that wasn't Babolat was taking notes from Babolat. I feel like Wilson created the Ultra as an answer to Babolat's Pure Drive or Pure Aero. And pretty much every company had some version of what they were basically marketing as a Pure Aero, but, you know, their Pure Aero. But none of them were quite like the Pure Aero, which, you know, could be a good or bad thing depending on what you're looking for. However, now it feels like Babolat might be taking notes from a brand like Yonex. Like I said, I am able to generate massive amounts of spin with the E-Zone 98. And that proves something. That proves that a denser string pattern doesn't necessarily mean that the racket is no longer spin friendly. Do you think the Pure Aero, which is like the most spin friendly racket of spin friendly rackets, would sacrifice the ability to hit massive amounts of topspin and still call itself a Pure Aero? No, they wouldn't. That would be insane to do that, because that is what this racket represents. It represents that kind of tennis. It was the series of rackets that pushed all the racket brands to start acknowledging that. So if you think that Babolat and the Pure Aero series are about to turn their backs to the influence that they started, you're crazy. But also, if you grab this racket and you demo it and you hit with a lot of topspin, you're going to see that this racket still has nasty topspin potential. And this racket might change your mind for anyone that thinks that having an open string pattern is really essential and like the key quality for having topspin friendly rackets. I think this racket will show you that maybe it's not. Now, do I think that an open string pattern is more conducive to spin than a denser string pattern on an otherwise completely identical racket? Yes, I do. I do think it matters. But I don't think it matters as pretty much every other quality about a racket that makes it spin friendly. So, long story short, this generation of Pure Aeros is basically a slightly more control-oriented and stable version of the Pure Aero, which I think really opens up a lot of potential for the versatility of this racket. I think one of the things that may have happened is that Alcaraz has really blown up and popularized the Pure Aero VS. However, I'm not totally sure about this, but he did switch the rackets that he's endorsing. He went from endorsing the Pure Aero VS to endorsing the new Pure Aero, which I thought was really annoying and disingenuous, but it's possible that he's playing with the new Pure Aero. However, I think it's more likely that the Pure Aero is kind of adjusting to what the Pure Aero VS was, which is basically just a slightly more control-oriented, precision-based Pure Aero. And I think it's very cool that they're going in that direction. So I really like this racket. As someone who is a self-proclaimed not Babolat guy, I might have to start saying, well, maybe that's not true anymore. And you know what? I think this paint job might actually be growing on me now that I've been talking so fondly of this racket. Maybe my heart and my eyes have opened up to this new digital paint job a little bit. It was just so different, and I'm kind of not a fan of the glossy paint jobs. I kind of feel like they're thumbprint magnets, and sometimes when your hand's a little sweaty and you're grabbing it by the throat and you want to let go or release on whatever, a volley, or you're switching grips for a forehand or a backhand, sometimes I feel like the glossy paint just kind of grips my skin a little bit and makes me delayed in some of the decisions. But yeah, sometimes the sun just bounces off and gets right into my eyeball on these darn glossy paint jobs. But if I'm going to look on the bright side, glossy paint jobs are generally more durable. Also, if you ever get a scratch on a glossy paint job, you can buff it out. You can't really buff out matte, because anytime you polish a surface, you polish it smooth, which means that you would polish it to gloss. So if you polish matte, you end up polishing it to gloss. You can never perfect polishing to a matte finish. That being said, gloss is just a more durable paint job. Like, it is literally able to stand abuse a little bit better than matte. Technically speaking, matte finishes are technically a blemished gloss. Anyway, they've also reduced the flex a little bit by 2 points. If you look back to 2013, to the Aero Pro drive that I was talking about, this racket has come down slowly but surely with each generation over time. It seems like they are becoming a little bit more flexible, a little bit softer. And now we're on this version of the racket, which has a much tighter string pattern, is more stable in the head, and is also notably softer. So I almost feel like this Babolat racket, this Pure Aero, doesn't quite fall into the stereotype that it kind of defined. And I think that's really interesting, specifically because it's Babolat. If it was some other racket brand, I would probably just talk about how it's kind of a knockoff Pure Aero, but not quite. But this is a Pure Aero. And it seems that even Babolat with their Pure Aero is starting to go in a direction that favors a little bit more control and precision and stability, as opposed to Topspin, no matter the cost. So I'm a fan of this racket. And I always appreciate a denser string pattern just because it'll get me another 2 or 3 hits, which is really nice. When you're breaking rackets enough to have to string once a week, it's always nice to get a couple more days out of each racket that you string. It's a big deal. If you haven't, I would highly suggest trying this racket. And that goes for anybody that is a Pure Aero fan or not a Pure Aero fan, because I think this racket is different enough to intrigue both sides of the spectrum. If you're the type of person that always gets the latest and greatest Pure Aero, I think there's a lot to appreciate from getting this new one. I feel like it kind of pushes the racket to play in a direction that I think is a little bit more interesting. And if you're someone that was kind of an anti-Babolat guy like me, you might be surprised, pleasantly surprised when you try this racket. And you might even find yourself thinking, I don't want to like it, but I kind of do. If you get around to demoing this racket, let me know in the comments. Let me know what you think. I think it's a really exciting change. I might just have to keep this one around for a little while. We'll see. But that is the video for now. If you would like to see more in a future video, be sure to subscribe, like, comment, etc. You can follow me and my clothing brand on Instagram at isn't.co. That's my clothing brand, and my tennis channel is Time for Tennis, just like you see it on the YouTube. Some of the content I post there is a little bit different than here, so, there's reasons to follow me there and here. Also, you can message me on Instagram, but I am responsive to comments as well as messages. So, I will see you in the next one.